We had a rich literature, I'll call it, of deterrence, in the sense that films and books, novels, deterred us from going to war because they showed us how terrible it would be. So I'm thinking about films like Dr. Strangelove, Failsafe, The Bedford Incident, novels like Tom Clancy's Red Storm Rising, Sir John Hackett's The Third World War, Neville Shute's On the Beach. You know, you pick up those novels, you see those films, and you start to realize, you know, life is pretty good. We don't want to end up in a global war. So thinking about that slice of the past, I began to then focus on this new Cold War that I believe we are embarked upon with China.
All right, I think that we will get started. So author and playwright Oscar Wilde once wrote, "To expect the unexpected shows a thoroughly modern intellect." I mean, who expects a novel at our chat and chatter sessions? The quote also surely suits our current era, a time when we can't dismiss anything as out of the question. Foreign interference in an election, raging global pandemic, a ransomware attack on a US oil pipeline. Although it is a novel, our book tonight discusses the scary, plausible, dire consequences of failures to imagine what could happen, to expect the unexpected. So what warning signs should we pay attention to? How do we avoid impending national security threats? And gulp, can we? We'll address these existential questions, and more tonight with Elliot Ackerman and Admiral Jim Stavridis, authors of 2034, a novel of the next world war. So at last, I am so delighted to introduce our guests tonight, Elliot Ackerman and Admiral Jim Stavridis, whom we can perhaps claim as somewhat our own, as both are connected to the Fletcher School at Tufts. Also, as many of you know, Admiral Stavridis has spoken for World Boston several times before, and we are thrilled to have you back, sir. Elliot Ackerman is the author of several novels, most recently Red Dress in Black and White. His books have been nominated for the National Book Award, among other awards. His writing often appears in Esquire, The New Yorker, and The New York Times. And his stories have been included in the Best American Short Stories and the Best American Travel Writing. He is both a former White House Fellow and Marine, and served 5 tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan, where he received the Silver Star, the Bronze Star for Valor, and the Purple Heart. Admiral Jim Stavridis spent more than 30 years in the US Navy, rising to the rank of 4-star admiral. He was the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO and previously commanded US Southern Command, overseeing military operations in Latin America. He holds a PhD from Fletcher, where he recently served 5 years as Dean. He has published 9 previous books and serves as a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion and Time Magazine. He's chair of the board of counselors of McClarty Global Associates and an operating executive of the Carlyle Group. And I just saw this last week, so I assume it's public, announced last week, he is the incoming chair of the Rockefeller Foundation. Very exciting. So gentlemen, welcome to Boston. Go right ahead.
Well, thanks, everybody. As advertised, I'm Admiral Jim Stavridis. I'm honored to be here with my marvelous co-author, Elliot Ackerman. And what I thought we'd do to kind of set up the book, because we've got, you know, a number of people will have read it, a number of people will have started it, some will have not gotten through it. So let me just begin with 5 minutes about how we came to write a novel, and then turn it over perhaps to Elliot to set the stage by talking about some of the characters in this book, because it is a very character-driven study. But let me begin with the question I get asked a lot after 9 works of nonfiction. I'm often asked, well, geez, Admiral, why'd you write a novel? And the answer is, I ended up writing a novel about the future because I looked to the past. And what I mean by that is that as I looked back on the Cold War of my youth, I graduated from Annapolis into the Cold War. When I looked at the US and Soviet Union, it occurred to me that at least part of why we never ended up in a global nuclear war was because we had a rich literature, I'll call it, of deterrence, in the sense that films and books, novels, deterred us from going to war because they showed us how terrible it would be. So I'm thinking about films like Dr. Strangelove, Failsafe, The Bedford Incident, novels like Tom Clancy's Red Storm Rising, Sir John Hackett's The Third World War, Neville Shute's On the Beach. You pick up those novels, you see those films, and you start to realize, life is pretty good. We don't want to end up in a global war. So thinking about that slice of the past, I began to then focus on this new Cold War that I believe we are embarked upon with China. We can debate whether we're in a Cold War, close to a Cold War, headed toward a hot war, who knows? I'm kind of with Henry Kissinger, who has said we are in the foothills of a Cold War. And my view is we are going up the mountain, not down. So with that, I began to think about, well, maybe I could write a novel that would have some kind of deterrent value to it, if you will, to a general public audience. Again, 9 books of nonfiction, they've sold well, but nothing like fiction to really reach a very broad audience, and also non-policy. I'm hopeful that many policy people will read the book, and I know for a fact many have, but I'm really hopeful that it'll be a book someone takes to the beach, to the mountain this summer, down to the shore, and they'll read it and they'll think, life is pretty good. We need to avoid the kind of story that's unfolding in 2034, a novel of the next World War. So with that as motivation, I kind of went to my publisher, Penguin Press, Random House, largest publisher in the world. And I went to my editor, a guy named Scott Moyers, and I said, hey, I've got this idea to write a novel. And he said, and I quote, Admiral, you are a great guy and you are a very good writer, but you're not a novelist. Well, that was kind of crushing because many of us who write books of nonfiction harbor this idea that eventually I'm going to write a great novel. So I was, not deterred. And I, in fact, was kind of like an 8-year-old kid. I put my hands on my hips and I said, Scott, I can too write a novel. I know I can write a novel. And my editor said, well, okay, write a detailed outline, give me a sample chapter, we'll take a serious look at it. So I went off and I did all that, brought it back, showed it to him. He called me up and he said, Admiral, you're a great guy. You're a pretty good writer, but you're not a novelist. But we know a novelist. And I said, well, okay, who is that? And he said, Elliot Ackerman. And it turns out I'd known Elliot Ackerman for quite a while, but why don't I let Elliot Ackerman pick up the story from there? Elliot?
Great. Yeah, thanks so much, Jim, and thanks so much for having us this evening. It's great to be at a Boston host event because so much of this story starts in Boston. So the Admiral and I had known each other for really the better part of a decade, and we had a shared editor. So when our shared editor mentioned this project to me, it certainly didn't feel like it was coming from out of the blue. And I'm a graduate of the Fletcher School, and the Admiral had actually brought me on when he was the dean as the writer in residence for a semester. And when he sent me an email with what my duties would entail, one of them in the bullet points was talk to the Admiral about books when he feels like it. So we had spent a lot of time talking about books and kind of sort of just becoming familiar with one another's sensibilities. So when this project was presented to me, we talked about the idea of the book, what it would look like, and our ambitions for it, and they were very much aligned from the outset. And it was that we wanted to really write a story that was a cautionary tale, that was character focused, and really wasn't going to be a huge door stopper that was kind of just inundated with technical details. So with that, we set about writing the book, and we set about writing with really a 5-character structure. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with the book, let me just sort of walk you through that. So when the book opens, you're introduced to the first of those 5 characters, and that is Commodore Sarah Hunt. And she is a veteran Navy officer, sort of towards the end of her career, and she is in command of 3 destroyers that are on a freedom of navigation patrol in the South China Sea, a body of water that today China claims as territorial waters. However, the rest of the international community sees as international waters. And that is a body of water that, just to give you a sense of it, is half the size of the continental United States, or the size of the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Oceans combined. So she is on this freedom of navigation patrol, and she sees what appears to be a fishing trawler in duress. And so she takes her 3 ships to go investigate and see what this trawler is. And she finds out that it is, in fact, anything but a fishing trawler. So now cut to our second principal character on the other side of the world, which is Marine Major Chris Wedge Mitchell. And he is a 4th-generation Marine fighter pilot. And when you meet him, he is flying his state-of-the-art F-35 fighter plane right up on the edge of Iranian airspace along the Straits of Hormuz. So much so that we describe him, literally his starboard wing is dancing along the border of Iranian airspace. And he's sitting there in this state-of-the-art fighter plane, lamenting the fact that he doesn't really feel much like a pilot. He feels more like a technician in this high-tech fighter plane. He doesn't feel like a pilot like his father, grandfather, or great-grandfather before him. And when he's lamenting the fact that he really isn't flying this plane, that it flies itself, well, that's in fact what it does. The plane diverts, its controls are taken into Iranian airspace, and Wedge Mitchell can't divert it out of Iranian space, and it goes on to a glide path toward Bandar Abbas airfield. Then we cut to our 3rd principal character, which is Dr. Sandeep Sandy Chowdhury. And he is sitting in the Situation Room of the White House. He works on the National Security Council staff. He's a graduate of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And he is trying to figure out what is going on with these twin incidents that are occurring right in front of him, both this incident in the South China Sea and this incident in the Straits of Hormuz with a aircraft that we've lost control of. And as he's trying to decipher what's going on, his telephone begins ringing. And on the other end of the line is our 4th principal character, and that is the China's military attaché to the United States, Chinese Admiral Lin Bao. And Admiral Lin Bao has a message for Sandy Chowdhury. The first part of that message is that the Chinese government will no longer tolerate the United States running these freedom of navigation patrols through its territorial waters. And the second part of that message is that these 2 incidents, the incident in the South China Sea and the incident over the Straits of Hormuz, are in fact related. After he delivers those 2 messages, the US is hit with a massive cyber attack. And the eastern seaboard is effectively blinked. When I say blinked, I mean the lights go out and the lights come back on. And when they come back on, everything isn't quite as it was before. That's the end of the first chapter of the book, so I'm not really spoiling much for you. And then I would only mention that you meet the 5th principal character in our book in the opening pages of the 2nd chapter. And when his aircraft lands on the tarmac at Bandar Abbas, waiting for him is Brigadier General Qasim Farshad, a member of the Iranian paramilitary Quds Force, a veteran of our 2 decades plus forever wars, although he had fought on the opposite side in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. And so through the eyes of those 5 principal characters, you're immersed into the world of 2034 And we see all of these nations enter into what ultimately becomes a global conflagration. So with that, I look forward to the conversation tonight.
Okay, thank you. So I think I'm going to take advantage of my spot here by asking a question. First of all, I mean, I don't have to say this. Loved the book. I truly recommend it. I read it on vacation for fun. It's a little scary, but it's a great read. So the book, this is sort of a big picture question, but the book seems to me about near future scenarios, cyber threats, et cetera. But also, I think really beautifully poses the question ultimately of like, why do this? What is the point of these rivalries? We can get ourselves into these situations, but Elliot, thinking of each of the characters is a good way to think about why we do this. I will not give away the ending, but I did not see it coming. There is a special geopolitical role, which I'm not going to give away, by an unexpected player that really highlights this question of why. So I was wondering, Admiral, if you could talk a little bit about that, and is the why ultimately part of a nation's strategic advantage?
Well, I think as we look at the world of 2034, a couple of trends which we can see today, I think are moving toward fruition. One is quite obviously, and most obviously, the rise of China. And this is a rise which will be economic, it will be geopolitical, it will be technological, and all of those themes are teased out in the book. So by 2034, on current trend lines, I think China will surpass the United States in technology. It will probably be at least even, if not a bit ahead, in terms of a combat scenario that is focused on East Asia. And economically, I'm almost certain will be ahead. Mass has a quality all its own, given the huge scale and size of China. So as China rises, we enter the domain, and I'm sure you've had our mutual friend Graham Allison there to talk about the Thucydides trap, this idea that throughout history, whenever an established power is challenged by a rising power, 2 out of 3 times a global war ensues. So history is not with us. And as we look at the rich basket of disagreement between China and the United States, it's hard to imagine it's going to get better over the next 10 years. We disagree, as Elliot said, about who owns the South China Sea, this enormous body of water. We think nobody owns it. It's international waters. China thinks China owns it. That's a big deal and hard to resolve. The future of Taiwan, by the way, is kind of wrapped up in that. Secondly, we're in a significant cyber conflict right now with China. Most recently, we had the so-called hafnium hack following the solar winds hack, solar wind from Russia, hafnium from China. This kind of unmarked, unattributed, shadowy war in cyber, I think, unfortunately, is going to continue. We have significant trade and tariff disagreements. We don't need to unpackage all of that this minute. The list goes on and on to include human rights violations, the origins of the pandemic. There's a lot of disagreement on the table. And I think, unfortunately, it is probable that it will continue to be extremely friction driven over the next 10 years. So as much as you can pose the question, and you do quite well, why would we do this? Gosh, that looks really dumb. Why would 2 nations stumble into a war? Well, look back 100 years ago, the last time the Thucydides trap closed was when Great Britain, established power, was challenged by Kaiser's Germany, rising power. How did that turn out in August of 1914? Not well. The Guns of August. Go back and reread that by Barbara Tuchman. All the logical incentives would say, let's not do this. Let's not get in a war. And as you read 2034, I hope as a reader, there are moments where you're literally screaming, stop, don't do this, pull the keys out of the car, you can still avoid this. That's all built into the idea of the novel. So I'm with you. I hope we never end up in a war with China. My son-in-law is Chinese American, first generation. I have two adorable, below the age of 3 grandchildren who are Chinese American. I've got skin in the game here. We don't want this. Nobody wants this. But could it happen? Yeah, that's the idea of a cautionary tale. Elliot?
I would only add, with regards to the Thucydides trap, and Mary, you kind of hinted at it, and I won't spoil the book, but there are always in wars unintended outcomes. So you have the established power is challenged by the rising power. I think obviously the example of the First and the Second World War vis-a-vis Great Britain and Germany is of course an apt one. But I'd say that, we're sitting here right now at what you could describe, the end of an American century. The last 100 years have been one that's dominated by the United States. And that is an American century that was forged in 2 European conflagrations, the First and the Second World War. And those were wars that the United States did not start. But we certainly finished those wars, and we're very much the beneficiaries of the geopolitical conditions that existed at the end of those wars. And now when we look at where the United States is in the year 2021, it would seem that we've actually gotten very good at starting wars, but we've gotten much less adept at finishing wars, and are engaging what I think you could call sort of late empire behavior and starting many of these wars that we cannot seem to finish. So I think the novel also deals with a lot of those themes and trying to situate where the United States could be in 14 years if we continue down this path, and how ready we would be to engage with a peer competitor. And I think ultimately, listen, the book is certainly about contemporary themes, but I think one of the things we endeavor to do too is to tell a story that engages with lots of the universal themes that exist in war, whether it's set in 2034, 1934, or 1034.
Okay. All right. I would like to pursue this line, but I'm not going to because we have a line of questions waiting. So Raul, go ahead. And if you could pick who you'd like to answer, that would be helpful.
This is actually for the Admiral. And thank you very much, Admiral and Elliot, for this presentation. While I'm tempted to ask you about the situations of the nation states of the time, I'd rather ask you about characters. And how did you determine what vulnerabilities and advantages you would build into your characters to make your story complete? I'm not sure if it's for you, Admiral, or for both of you.
Oh, I think that one is for the master novelist. So I'm going to throw that one to Elliot. Maybe I'll bat clean up on whatever he says. But and here I want to make a serious point. And as I said at the beginning, I'm a first-time novelist. Elliot Ackerman is a 5th-time novelist and a finalist for the National Book Award. I learned a lot writing this book with Elliot Ackerman. Elliot?
Thanks. I like to tell people, Raul, that, for a book that's about a very grim subject, we sure had a lot of fun writing it. And I would say, and a part of the joy in writing it is figuring out who these characters were and trying to get close to them, because you have to kind of get close to your characters to understand their psyche. And I think, if you were to peel back the onion a little bit, you would find lots of the two of us in each of these characters, in all of 5 of these characters, and many of the secondary characters in ways that are probably unexpected. It might be obvious to say that, the Marine major has a lot in common with me and my experience, and there's certainly some truth in that, or that Admiral Sarah Hunt has a great deal in common with the Admiral's experience. But I would also point out that Brigadier General Qasim Farshad, who served with the Iranian Quds Force, is a character I relate to deeply because he is a veteran of the Forever Wars. And I know that Admiral Limbao is a character that Admiral Stavridis relates to really deeply. He not only is he a long-serving officer in the Chinese Navy, he's also an educator. And so I think for us, in many respects, building these characters, we were drawing from our own experiences and accreting our experiences in sort of unexpected ways into the experiences that these characters were having on the page. And then I would only add too, that I think one of the things that was so enjoyable at the novel is we had a very clear sense of what we wanted this book to be. And because we had a clear sense of what we wanted it to be, we knew the themes we were trying to engage with and how they would manifest in the characters. So I only bring that up as, there's themes, for instance, like, what is America about? What is this 20th century version of America about? And in Wedge, his call sign is Wedge, and Wedge is the world's simplest and oldest tool. He is sort of the embodiment of this 20th century American military officer brimming with machismo. As the Admiral likes to say, he's straight out of the volleyball scene from Top Gun. And then you have a character like Dr. Sandeep Chowdhury, who's a first-generation American immigrant. And he is understanding, in many respects, the limitations that exist with his country in this crisis. We're drawing from many places as we're creating these characters. And I would just say, to me, that in writing a novel, that's always the great joy, is when the characters sort of show up on the page and they start telling you who they are.
I must follow up for just a second. Were any of the characters you encountered as a White House fellow represented in this novel? I say that as a former fellow myself.
Oh, okay. I would say my experience working at the White House as a fellow certainly informed maybe not one character directly, although there are some characters in the White House who maybe are influenced by people who walk those corridors. But it definitely situated me in the scenes of feeling like I understood, the corridors these characters are walking down. And I know the Admiral has similar experiences as well in the White House.
Yeah, I'll simply say, I had 6 tours in the Pentagon, 1 at the NSC staff and 1 at State Department. So I know this terrain pretty well. And I would hope that most people would notice that the only really dark character in the novel is a West Point graduate in the White House. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Seth, hello. Welcome back to Boston. I think you're down Georgetown way these days, right? Go ahead with your question and please mention who you'd like to answer.
That's right. Thanks very much, Mary. I'm Seth Johnston, a West Point graduate, so I'll try not to darken the conversation too much. Gentlemen, congratulations on a really wonderful book, and thank you for speaking to us today. Looking forward to more of this great conversation. I'd like to follow up, though, right where Admiral Stavridis began, which was with the motivation for writing this novel. And the importance of the public policy importance of being able to visualize what's the worst that could happen as some kind of a preventative measure, to keep things in perspective and hopefully to avoid war. My question is, I wonder if you could assess how badly the United States needs this kind of visualizing tool, and whether you think that the United States needs it perhaps more or less than some of the other important countries that feature in your book. I would just offer that many of the histories of the Cold War, for example, point to the personal experience that many of the decision makers and leaders had during that time. Their personal experience with war in World War II acted as a real break on their own decision making and thinking about conflict. Is the lack of any kind of great power conflict of that scale something that, as a matter of historical phenomenon makes your book more important, and books like it more important today than it might be, since so many of the decision makers do not have that personal experience of having lived it. Thank you.
Thanks, Seth. A wonderful question. I'm actually going to ask Elliot to answer that. He's been doing a lot of writing and thinking about civil military relationships. I think you were in Afghanistan leading a task force at one point. So you understand exactly how important this is. But I think, Elliot, you want to take a swing at that, and then I'll chime in?
Yeah, sure. I think, well, first said, I think, you hit the nail on the head, and the Admiral mentioned that the spirit of this book was trying to make what would be a war with China seem like a fully imagined and realized event in a way that we had not seen anybody do thus far. But I think that, right now, the lack of military or wartime experience amongst many decision makers is a challenge, in so much as war, the American conception of war at least, has evolved over time. War today is something that 1% of the nation fights, and it's something that's funded through our deficits, so no one pays any taxes. So in many ways, we've been largely anesthetized to war. So when war comes up in the conversation, and I don't say this as a moral calculus, but most Americans are like, well, it doesn't really affect me. I mean, we've been at war for a long time, and my life has gone on as usual. I think any of us who are students of history know, yes, that's one form of war. There's also the other form of war, which, if we all think this pandemic has been disruptive in the last year, wait until you try to fight a war against a peer level adversary. That's going to disrupt all of our lives. But that is not as present in our psyche. And do I believe that one book can turn the tide on that? Obviously not. But but we can throw a pebble in the pond, per se, and try to add to the conversation. Say, hey, this is a very, very different type of war. So I think that was very much the spirit in which we wrote the book.
Yeah, and let me ask a different question and answer it, which is, I was asked a couple of times ago, well, Admiral, if you could pick one person on the planet Earth and force him or her to read the book, who would that be? And, I thought about Beyonce and, social networks, but then I thought, no, the right answer to that question is Xi Jinping. I would want Xi Jinping to read this book. Because if I could get a photo of him holding the book, that would be even better than Beyonce, because I'd sell 400 million copies overnight in China. But B, your question, your point, because I want other nations, other societies to look at this book. So far, we have sold the rights to this book in 16 different nations. I think that number is going to continue to rise. And I think that's important. Your point, Seth, that this is not an American novel in any sense. Someone was criticizing me the other day online, which hardly ever happens. No, actually, it happens a lot. And the criticism was, Admiral, don't you understand the difference between the good guys and the bad guys? Yeah, I think I do. On the other hand, in this book, this is not Tom Clancy, US good guys, China bad guys, good guys win, bad guys lose, because that's not what life is like. It's not what the world is like. And yeah, I have a viewpoint on that in terms of relative good and bad, but the Chinese, believe me, have a viewpoint that's informed by 5,000 years of history that is, shall we say, different than mine. And in the end, in this book, there are no good guys and bad guys. The villain is war.
Okay. Great, thank you. Okay, so we're going to go now to Jim Kaufman, one of our wonderful board members. Hi, Jim. And do mention who you'd like to answer for you.
Thanks, Mary. Admiral Stavridis, welcome back to World Boston. Thank you for doing this. Also, Mr. Ackerman. Admiral Stavridis, I couldn't help but note your mention of Dr. Strangelove, by far my favorite movie for the last 50 plus years. And I'm thrilled that you actually ascribe the role that I've thought it may have played in world culture since its production. Mr. Ackerman mentioned the characters and the scenario as it unfolded at the beginning of the novel. I couldn't help but note that a US warplane, an F-35, was patrolling the border of Iran in 2034. Is that simply a literary device, or are you that pessimistic that we won't have solved the belligerence of Iran's current regime as far into the future as 2034?
I am fairly confident we will not have solved belligerence with Iran as much as I would like to. And I think that there are powerful arguments for attempting to work with the Iranians to try and kind of bring them into the culture of nations. This, of course, was the whole idea behind JCPOA. I know World Boston, I'm sure, has had a whole stream of speakers explaining the logic of the Obama administration in creating this deal and ultimately trying to open up Iran and move it forward. But I got to tell you, Jim, and no one knows the answer here, I'm pessimistic over the next 10 to 15 years. And partly it's because China, which is nothing if not a smart strategic nation, has focused on two big muscle movements, both of which come to fruition in this novel. One is the relationship between China and Russia, which is drawn closer and closer together. And I think that's unfolding in real time in front of our eyes. 3 weeks ago, don't forget, we wrote this book 2 years ago. 3 weeks ago, we see Russia and China agree to build a lunar research facility on the moon, obviously. The largest military exercise since the end of the Cold War is now annually conducted on the Russian-Chinese border in Siberia. Hundreds of thousands of troops involved in this. So that's part of the plan. Another significant part of the plan is to draw Russia and China closer together. Again, we wrote this 2 years ago, started writing it, finished it over a year ago. What's happening right now between China and Russia? China has just announced a $400 billion investment, and that's the down payment on working with Iran. So I think China is playing a smart, long game, building alliances. And by the way, the other point to take away, speaking of alliances, is in this book, where's NATO? Where's Japan? Where's Australia? They're nowhere. This is a reflection of what would happen if we don't tend the garden of our allies, partners, and friends. And not to get political here, but over the last 4 years, we did not, under the Trump administration, do a very good job at tending that garden. What happened? That garden started to wither. And if we don't tend that garden and water it and arrive and engage and have reasonable dialogue with the 30 nations of NATO, with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia, New Zealand, Colombia, I could go on and on. If we don't do that, we'll end up, as we postulate in 2034, alone and kind of afraid. We need to avoid that, in my view. So unfortunately, Jim, the answer to the question is, yeah, I don't see Iran flipping away from China. I don't see Russia flipping away from China. And I hope that we are smart enough, here's the cautionary tale part of this, to tend that garden, because we got a balance. And I'll conclude by saying the swing vote in this is going to be India. We better pay attention to India.
Thank you.
You bet.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think we have Tom Smith next. Hi, Tom. Come on camera and go right ahead. And let us know who your question is for.
Yeah, thanks. My question is for the Admiral. I'm intrigued about the kind of war that American forces are fighting in 2034. Some years ago, I worked for Andy Marshall in the Pentagon on something called the Revolution in Military Affairs. And clearly the cyber aspect that you've already talked about is a big difference. But I'd be interested in how you characterize how you chose the level of readiness of U.S. forces to fight in a very different war, and how different in other ways is that warfare?
So I'm going to answer the first part of the question, but I'm going to ask Elliot to tell the story of the Battle of Agincourt, which I think kind of informs what I'm about to tell you. I think that we, the United States, are not sufficiently aggressive in moving the rheostat of our defense spending from traditional legacy platforms. So think tanks, fighters, aircraft carriers, moving that rheostat toward 21st century systems, cyber, offensive and defensive, unmanned vehicles, space. You know, we've got the rheostat moving a bit. That's good. It needs to move better, faster, smarter. And if we don't, we're going to end up like French knights in Agincourt. Elliot?
Yeah, I would only offer that that was certainly one of the themes in the book, was this idea of, it's not just enough to have the most cutting edge, advanced or sophisticated technology, but it's also essential to have the correct technology and the ability to adapt. And so a historical analogy that I think was certainly present in my mind was the Battle of Agincourt. I don't know if you or anyone listening was familiar with it, but in 1415, that was a battle in which a group of very well-equipped, very professional and disciplined French knights, wearing at the time the most state-of-the-art plate armor, stood on a battlefield in France, and in front of them was it rained the night before, so there was a wet, muddy field, and on the other side of the field were a bunch of ill-equipped, exhausted, starving English longbowmen who did not have that state-of-the-art armor. It was extremely expensive, but they had relatively cheap, inexpensive, but a new technology, which was that longbow with a fully fletched arrow. And when the French knights went across the field, they were slaughtered in the thousands by much smaller and much more poorly equipped, in some respects, English longbowmen. So, we don't want to be the French in this situation. We want to be the English longbowmen, and we want to make sure that our legacy platforms don't become the equivalent of plate armor in the 15th century.
Can I just add a personal note as a Navy officer? When I graduated from the Naval Academy in 1976, otherwise known as 1.2 million years ago, I was pretty good with a sextant. I could walk up on the bridge of a ship and shoot the stars, get out my nautical almanac, and more or less tell you where we were. By the time I was in my mid-30s as a sea captain for the first time on a brand new, beautiful, high-tech Arleigh Burke destroyer, you couldn't find a sextant. I mean, we were doing everything, GPS, just like we do now in our cars, getting from point A to point B. And that was great. It's a lot more efficient. You didn't have to get out a pencil and figure things out. But what happens if we are in a situation where that exquisite technology becomes suddenly unavailable and we don't know how to use that sextant anymore? Today at the Naval Academy, I assure you, the class of 2021 knows how to use a sextant. They brought that back about 6 years ago, and I think it'll stay. And the point is, with all this exquisite technology, you want that. You want to be able to take advantage of all of these high-tech opportunities in warfare, as you do in any other field of human endeavor. But you better have a plan B. And as both Elliot and I have said, it is no coincidence. We used to say in the Cold War with the Soviets, they would say, it is no coincidence, comrade, It is no coincidence, comrade, that the first airplane you see in 2034 is a 6th, 7th generation Joint Strike Fighter. The last aircraft you see is an old beat up junker of an F-18 Hornet, first generation of Hornets. Have a plan B, part of the answer, Tom. And you know that from Andy Marshall. What a wonderful mentor he was to so many of us.
Indeed.
Okay, great,
Thank
thank you. Let's go to Mary. Hi, Mary, and let us know who you'd like to answer your question.
Sure. Actually, this is for Admiral Stavridis, and a question suddenly popped up into my mind as I was waiting. First off, did they bring back Morse code? Second, you said you'd learned a lot writing. What did you learn? And my third question is, do you really think Russia will be content? It's got a much smaller economy, much tiny population base in comparison to China. That makes them basically the junior partner. Do you think they'd really be satisfied staying as the junior partner of such a powerful and large country?
Morse code never went away. We still have the ability
Okay.
to use it between Navy ships at sea. There's a longer backstory conversation about the rate, the specialty of signalmen that did go away.
Okay.
And we turned to quartermasters who used the sextants, and they had to learn the Morse code. That is not working out perfectly. I wouldn't be surprised to see signalmen as a specialty come back. But you'll be pleased to know Morse code has never gone away. Russia as a junior partner, I often say I agree with you. Vladimir Putin should be careful what he asks for. Because if you are China and you look at Siberia, which is Russia to the east of the Ural Mountains, it's the size of the continental United States of America. And it's full of oil, gas, timber, arable land, potable water, gold, rare earths, diamonds. You get the idea. How many people live there in an area the size of the continental United States, right? Maybe 20 million people. Think the population of New York, except nobody else lives in the country. China looks at that like my dog looks at a ribeye steak. It looks really good. So Vladimir, my friend, be careful, or you are going to end up in a place you really don't want to be.
Okay, so listen up, Vladimir. So I think we're. Oh wait, Mary. So I think we're there, right?
Was there a middle question?
Yes, there was. What did you learn? You said you
Oh,
learned
I'm
a lot
sorry.
writing
That's
the book.
the most important thing.
What did you learn? And then you walked away from it. It's like,
I checked that blot because I really think Elliot is the right guy to answer that question.
okay.
But I'll take a swing at it. I learned three things watching Elliot write fiction. One is, he's described it already, the way in a novel you should let the characters walk onto the stage and tell their story without fear or favor. Let them tell the story. Number two, fit and finish matter. Something you park in chapter 1 might need to reappear in chapter 3 and then come to culmination in chapter 6. I think that's really important, that details kind of fit together. And thirdly, and I think this is true of Eliot's novels, but I'd love him to speak on this. Don't write War and Peace. Don't write massive door stoppers. People don't want to read those books anymore. And that's okay. If you do the first two things I mentioned, you can write a book of 50,000 words that engages the reader and brings his or her mind to bear. That's what I learned. Elliot?
Well, we talked a lot about policy. I would say I learned how to write with someone. I've never written with anybody before. And we had a lot of fun writing this book and figuring out our rhythm and how we were going to tell this story. And we're turning it into a trilogy. So there's going to be 2 more books in this series. And we're at
Cool.
with those right now. So I think, so for me, the, there were many things I learned, but I'd say that the greatest one was to have a partner, and I think we've had a lot of fun doing these books together.
Indeed, well said.
Excellent.
Yeah, you definitely left us hanging with Admiral Hunt and the ringing phone and some
So
other
you'll find
things.
out next one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it moves. The story, like life, moves on. Like the gypsies say, the carnival moves on.
Okay.
Wait for it.
All right. Can't wait. So Tori, we're going to go to Tori, I think.
Great. Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much for this conversation. I have to start off by saying that the only aspect of this book I found remotely lighthearted was and as a fellow Fletcher grad, was the kind of Fletcher backgrounds of a few of your characters in the book. So thank you for adding that note into it. My question for Admiral Stavridis, but also Elliot, if you'd like to chime in on this, is just a simple question of, if you were advising the Biden administration now, what steps should the United States take in its relations with China to avoid the situation that you outline in your book? So what steps should the US take now to keep your work of fiction a fiction? And just as a very brief follow-up, do you inherently believe that there's anything the United States can do to actually influence and affect the decisions that China will make now and in the near future?
Yeah, question 2, I think, is the easier of the two. And I think the answer is yes. And history shows us that a determined effort to influence, I'll put it this way, all but the most fanatic opponents will bear fruit. And I don't see China in the fanatic opponent category. I think China has a deeply rooted confidence in its own society and a vision of where it wants to go in the future. Those are two things that create formidable opponents. But I don't see them as locked into a sense of, and our ultimate goal is to make the United States look like China. I don't think that's where they're trying to take this. So yeah, I think we can influence them. So then part 1 of the question is, okay, Stavridis, so what would you do to influence them? I'd start by imagining how bad this can be. And there will be others who imagine different patterns and outcomes. But start by creating a group of people who can creatively think their way into the future and postulate what it could look like, 2034 being but one example. Then, and here's the pragmatic part, Tori, reverse engineer it. How do you get back to the present, 15 years roughly, where we are now? And what do you do to influence it? I'll give you 5 quick things. One won't surprise you. One is have a plan. We don't have a plan. I give the Trump administration credit for observing correctly the looming tower of the challenges, but their idea of a plan was non-existent. It was really to, at 1 minute, host a big boozy dinner down at Mar-a-Lago for the new BFF, President Xi, and 4 weeks later, slap on 40% tariffs. Both of those could be part of a plan, but not together and not within 4 or 5 weeks. That's just chaos under heaven. And so number 1, have a plan. And who ought to write this plan? I'd put together an all-star team. I'd probably put Henry Kissinger on the team. I'd put Kurt Campbell, who's the NSC director for China. I could give you 20 names. Others could give you more names. Get a really good team and task them with writing the plan. I think the plan ought to include a significant military component that ensures we do not, at a minimum, fall behind China in critical military technologies, back to Agincourt. Number 2, we need a significant economic plan that can compete with One Belt, One Road. How do we do that? Hey, we've been at the idea of One Belt, One Road, which is simply soft power by another name, for decades. We kind of know the basics of this. We can do it. We can compete. It'll take some resources, but yeah, we need an economic component to the plan. 4th point, we need a cultural piece of this. We need a narrative. We need a strategic communications conversation that says, hey, look, we're the United States of America. These are our values: democracy, liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, gender equality, racial equality. Look, we execute them imperfectly. Got it. They're the right values. They're a lot better than putting 1 million Muslims in concentration camps, for example. So we need a strategic cultural narrative that simply lays out in what some have said to me, oh yeah, you're right, Admiral, we're in a war of ideas. No, we're in a marketplace of ideas. We got to compete. Our ideas, my view, are the right ones. They can compete. We got to tell that story. And then fifth and finally, we need to compete in the tech world, And here I mean everything from STEM education to learning how to code to controlling, but still having freedom of speech in our social networks. Huge, big, chewy problem. But tech can help us here. And this is cyber, nanotechnology, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, machine learning. That's going to be a zone of the plan that's really important. I know you're familiar, but for all on the call, I'd recommend the recently released National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, led by a former DepSecDef Bob Work and former chairman of Google, Eric Schmidt. So that would be the bare bones of the plan. There's a lot of complexity under each of those tranches, Tori.
Elliot, did you want to chime in on that, or?
I see we're almost at time, so I just add that I think also being cognizant of the fact that our hyper-partisan, dysfunctional politics here at home only makes us vulnerable to projecting a vision of internal weakness that could provoke one of our adversaries to perhaps miscalculate and decide they want to do something like an incursion into Taiwan, for instance. So I think having our own house in order prevents conflict as well.
Yeah, actually, I want to amend everything I said and put that at the top of the list. Well said, Elliot. And I think that's going to do it, folks. I've got to bounce. What a wonderful talk. Mary, I'll let you wrap it up.
Okay, thank you very much, Admiral Stavridis. Thank you very much, Elliot Ackerman. Wow, I have so many more things to talk about. Everybody who's on the call, save our authors, please come on over to the post-chat chat, particularly the people who ask questions, because I have questions for you. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here, and have a great night.